There is a very specific moment that happens when you arrive in the right place, and if you have ADHD or a sensitive nervous system, you will recognize it immediately, even if you've never had words for it before. It's not excitement, and it's not even happiness at first. It's something quieter. Your shoulders drop slightly without you deciding to relax. Your breathing becomes deeper without you trying to control it. Your thoughts, which are usually layered and fast and overlapping, begin to slow down just enough that you can follow one of them again. And for the first time in a while, you don't feel like you are constantly adjusting to your environment. What most people don't realize is that this feeling has very little to do with beauty, and almost nothing to do with how famous or impressive a place is. It has to do with how much your nervous system has to process every second. Because if your brain is already working harder than average to filter input, to manage stimulation, to maintain focus, then the environment you place it in becomes one of the most important variables in how you feel on a daily basis. And this becomes even more pronounced after 40, when energy is less forgiving, when hormonal changes affect regulation, and when the cost of overstimulation is no longer just temporary exhaustion, but something that can stay with you for days. France is one of the few countries where you can still find environments that were not designed around speed, efficiency, and constant output, but around rhythm, structure, and human-scale living. And in this video, I want to show you 5 cities in France that consistently feel calmer, more regulating, and more supportive for ADHD and sensitive minds, not as a superficial list, but as a deeper understanding of what actually makes a place feel good to your brain so that you can begin to choose environments more intentionally, whether you are traveling or thinking about where you want to spend more time in the future. Why France feels different. Before we go into the cities themselves, it's important to understand why France as a whole often feels different from many other places, especially if you are coming from environments that are highly optimized for speed, productivity, and constant stimulation. Many French cities developed long before modern urban planning focused on traffic flow, commercial density, and maximum efficiency. Instead, they evolved slowly, often centered around walking, local markets, and social interaction that follows a daily rhythm rather than a continuous stream of activity. This means that the nervous system is not constantly forced into micro-adjustments. The streets are often narrower, which naturally slows movement. The architecture tends to follow a certain visual coherence, which reduces the amount of visual processing your brain has to do. There are clear pauses in the day, especially around meals, where the entire environment shifts into a slower state. And perhaps most importantly, there is less pressure to always be on. For a neurotypical person, this might simply feel pleasant, but for an ADHD or highly sensitive brain, this can mean the difference between constant low-level stress and actual regulation. Calm, in this context, is not about silence or isolation. It is about the combination of predictable rhythm, manageable sensory input, and an environment that does not constantly demand your attention. And once you begin to understand that, you start to see why certain places feel so different, even if they are not dramatically quieter or less populated than others. Uzès. Uzès is one of those places that rarely appears on typical travel lists, and that is precisely what makes it so valuable from a nervous system perspective, because it has not been shaped by mass tourism to the same extent as more well-known destinations. It is a small town in the Occitanie region, with fewer than 10,000 residents, and what defines it is not a single landmark or attraction, but an overall sense of contained, quiet continuity. The streets are made of warm stone. The scale is small enough that you can understand the entire town within a short period of time, and there is a noticeable absence of urgency in how people move and interact. For an ADHD brain, this matters in a very specific way because one of the biggest sources of exhaustion is not just stimulation itself, but the unpredictability of it. In a place like Uzès, the sensory environment is extremely stable. You are not constantly surprised by sudden noise, fast movement, or abrupt changes in visual input. Instead, everything unfolds slowly and in a way that your brain can anticipate. There is still life, especially on market days, but it is structured life, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. This creates a form of regulation that is often missing in larger or more dynamic environments, where your nervous system is always slightly on alert. What makes Uzès particularly effective is that it is not empty. There is still a sense of community, of local rhythm, of daily life that continues regardless of whether you are there or not. And this balance between stillness and presence is something many sensitive people intuitively seek, even if they cannot immediately explain why. Colmar. Instead of presenting Colmar as universally calm, it is much more accurate to understand it as a place that offers a very specific type of regulation under the right conditions. Because while the visual coherence of the town is exceptionally high, with aligned architecture, soft colors, and minimal visual conflict, the actual experience can change significantly depending on timing. During peak travel periods or in the middle of the day, the narrow streets can fill quickly, and what is visually calming can become cognitively demanding simply due to the density of people and the reduced ability to move freely, which for an ADHD or sensitive nervous system can create a subtle but persistent form of tension. However, early in the morning or outside of high season, Colmar transforms into something very different, almost unusually still, where the visual harmony can actually do what it is supposed to do, which is reduce processing effort and allow the brain to settle. This makes it less of a universally calm destination and more of a highly effective regulating environment when approached with the right timing and expectations. Nimes introduce a different form of calm, one that is not based on quietness or visual softness alone, but on structure, proportion, and the way space is organized, because unlike smaller towns that feel peaceful simply due to reduced activity, Nimes maintains a certain level of life while distributing it across a layout that feels open, legible, and mentally manageable, which is particularly relevant for an ADHD or sensitive nervous system that tends to become overwhelmed not just by stimulation itself, but by the effort required to constantly orient within it. Located in southern France, the city is known for its Roman heritage, and this influence is still visible in the way streets open into wider spaces, how buildings align with each other, and how movement flows through the city without excessive compression, which means that even when there are people, even when there is activity, it does not immediately translate into pressure or urgency because the environment itself absorbs part of that intensity. What makes this especially supportive is the combination of clarity and breathing space. Because your brain is not forced into continuous micro-adjustments, you can see further ahead, you can anticipate movement more easily, and you are less likely to encounter sudden sensory spikes that require rapid adaptation, which over time is one of the main sources of exhaustion for people who are already operating with a higher baseline of sensitivity. At the same time, Nimes does not feel empty or withdrawn. It still offers cafes, public spaces, and a daily rhythm that allows for engagement, but that engagement is framed within a structure that keeps it from becoming chaotic, and this balance is often where regulation becomes sustainable rather than temporary. Compared to places that rely on stillness or isolation to create calm, Nimes shows that a city can remain alive and socially present while still supporting the nervous system, as long as the underlying structure reduces friction instead of adding to it. And this is an important distinction because for many people, especially after 40, the goal is not to remove stimulation entirely, but to experience it in a way that does not continuously drain energy. And in that sense, Nimes offers something that is often harder to find than silence, which is a form of calm that exists within activity rather than outside of it. Biarritz. Biarritz adds a different regulatory mechanism, which is natural rhythm through the ocean, and this can be particularly powerful for individuals whose nervous systems respond well to repetitive sensory input. Located on the Atlantic coast in southwestern France, Biarritz is more dynamic than the other cities on this list, but the presence of the ocean changes how that dynamism is perceived and processed. The movement of waves, the sound of water, and the openness of the horizon create a continuous, predictable pattern that the brain can synchronize with. This type of sensory input is fundamentally different from the fragmented, unpredictable stimuli found in busy urban environments. Instead of requiring constant attention, it provides a background rhythm that supports downregulation. At the same time, Biarritz offers more space, both physically and mentally. The open coastline reduces the feeling of confinement that some people experience in smaller towns, and this can be particularly beneficial for those who feel overwhelmed not only by stimulation but also by density. However, because it is more active, especially during peak travel periods, it requires a bit more intentional timing if you want to experience its calmer side fully. Annecy. Annecy brings together several of the elements we have talked about, and this is why it often creates such a strong and immediate sense of calm for many people, especially those with sensitive or easily overstimulated nervous systems. Located in southeastern France near the Swiss border, Annecy is structured around a lake, an old town with canals, and a surrounding mountain landscape, and this combination creates a very clear and intuitive spatial organization. From a cognitive perspective, this is extremely valuable because your brain does not have to constantly orient itself. You always know where you are in relation to the main elements of the environment, and this reduces one of the subtle but continuous sources of mental effort. At the same time, the visual environment is highly coherent, with soft colors, consistent architectural styles, and the presence of water, which introduces a natural sense of movement without chaos. What makes Annecy particularly powerful is the way it integrates nature into the structure of the city. The lake is not separate from daily life, it is part of it, and this allows for regular, effortless exposure to one of the most regulating elements available to the nervous system. Combined with a generally slower pace and a culture that does not prioritize constant urgency, this creates an environment where many people feel a noticeable shift within a very short time. Once you start looking at places through this lens, the question changes from "where should I go?" to "what does my nervous system actually need right now?" Because calm is not a fixed quality, and the environment that feels supportive at one point in your life may not be the same later, especially as your energy, your sensitivity, and your overall capacity change. Instead of focusing on reputation or aesthetics, it becomes much more useful to evaluate places based on a few key dimensions: the level of noise and unpredictability, the coherence of the visual environment, the pace of movement, the presence of natural elements, and the overall rhythm of daily life. These factors determine how much work your brain has to do, and therefore how much energy you have left for everything else. And when you begin to choose environments with this level of awareness, travel stops being something that drains you and starts becoming something that actively supports your nervous system, your clarity, and your overall sense of well-being. If this way of thinking about places resonates with you, then this channel is designed exactly for that: a calmer, more structured, and more intelligent way of living and traveling, especially for complex, sensitive minds after 40. And I would really like to know from you, not which city you liked the most, but what type of environment your nervous system responds to most strongly. Is it water? Is it structure? Or is it rhythm?